This is the second part of the session on critical thinking and argumentation within your writing. In this lecture, we will focus on synthesis and argumentation when you're writing an essay. One of the key aspects of an assignment is to develop an argument. Once you have looked at the key literature critically, you should tell the reader what it means and develop your message. And this lecture focuses on the synthesis and argumentation which you need for your essay writing. Okay, say you have now selected your literature and have critiqued the selected articles. How do you move forward? How do you work out what they mean? First of all, indicate quantity of information available. You could do this by stating number of relevant articles reviewed, how many studies were available, and whether you decided to filter from the available studies. You should then indicate the quality of information available, which is through your critique. For example, for the formative assessment of this module, imagine you have critically analyzed 6 studies. You would now summarize your critical analysis of each of the study to indicate the quality of evidence included. You may want to use a critique table to bring the information together, which also allows direct comparison between studies. Once you have indicated the quantity and quality of the information, you will be able to come to conclusions and explain what it means and what the implications are. Once you have read your literature, you might want to use tools such as tables or mind maps to help you organize your information. And it is now time to synthesize and tell the reader, so what? You need to tell the reader which information is most credible and why. What does the information say, and in your view, what is the overall story or message? For example, you may tell the reader whether you will change your practice based on the evidence presented. You will also need to say what is still needed, are there gaps to be filled, and what would you do next, and what would you do differently. It is important to develop your argument as you go within the assignment. We will discuss argumentation in more detail in this lecture. It is key to keep linking up your writing to the task. All the information you include and discuss should be relevant to the task. One of the skills you will need at master's level is selectivity, so that you are selective in what you include. While you are developing your argument, you might need to have small conclusions within the body of the assignments, which will help you to build story for the reader, and as each conclusion moves the argument forward. Now imagine the information as dots which are scattered. By using conclusions within the body of the assignment, you are trying to join the dots. So you select the most relevant information and join the dots to move your argument forward. In order to effectively synthesize information in an assignment, you need to be capable of argumentation. As we discussed in an earlier slide, you need to be developing your argument throughout your assignment, which will effectively help you to answer the question. This slide says that everybody should come and study at QMU. Nobody should go and do a master's somewhere else, or even think about it, not even after they have done a master's at QMU. Is this an argument? It is not, but why not? Take a moment and think about what would you need to add to make it an argument. If you're arguing that everybody should come and study at QMU, there should be a reason for that argument. For example, if you're saying QMU is the best place to study international health, there's a reason to then come and study international health at QMU. However, is stating the reason enough? You also need to consider or provide evidence to the claim. Effective arguments are like a house. The claims should have clear reasons built on evidence. Through argumentation, you're trying to persuade someone to accept a conclusion. And for this, you need to offer reasons and evidence to back up the reasons. Also, if something is an argument which has a reason, it is not necessarily a convincing argument. Keep this in mind when you're developing your argument. Think about whether yours is convincing. Now look at the argument on the slide. Manchester United is the best football team in England because they have beaten many teams. Is this a good argument? How could you criticize this argument? Well, maybe it is luck. Maybe there are other teams which have beaten similar number or more teams. In this case, while there is a reason does not fully support the claim. And what is the evidence? You can also criticize arguments. Now let's look at another example. The argument here is people should not go to traditional healers because their effectiveness is not proven. Now, this argument can be opposed on two bases. One, if the argument is false, but you will need to provide the evidence which proves it is false. And second, it might be true, but there is not enough evidence. Not having enough evidence doesn't mean that it is not effective, and people might want to take the chance. Inductive arguments. Now, this is the type of arguments you will be using a fair amount in your assignments when you're attempting to generalize based on a body of evidence. In this kind of arguments, the conclusions are likely and not certain. Let's look at the two examples on the slides. Both of them are using cases or numbers to establish a likely conclusion. Hence, they are both inductive arguments. There are questions you need to ask while you're assessing how strong is the inductive argument. Firstly, are the cases true? And are there enough cases to warrant generalization? Now, let's have a look at the example here. So the argument is, I have spoken to 60 women in this village. 50 had more than 3 children. Therefore, it is likely that the next woman I encounter will have more than 3 children. Now, how could you apply these questions to this case? First of all, are number of children reported correctly? And secondly, do 50 out of 60 cases warrant generalization? To answer the second question, you may need some knowledge of statistics. Then there is the question whether generalization truly follow from the cases. Let's look at this example. Most learning methodology students are from outside Scotland. Therefore, it is likely that the student joining us next week is non-European. How could you apply the question about generalization and whether they follow from cases to this argument? Now, what is the problem with this argument? From outside Scotland does not necessarily mean also outside European. There are other countries within Europe. So this argument doesn't follow, this generalization doesn't follow from the cases. One of the things to keep in mind while you're making inductive arguments is that you should not jump from one case to all or always. For example, consider the statement, in Nigeria, the health insurance schemes work well. Therefore, health insurance will work in Africa and should be introduced. Now, what is the problem with this argument? Does this conclusion really follow from the reason? Remember the house of argument in which roof of conclusion sits on the beams of reason and foundation of evidence. Are the roof and beams within the house? There are some key elements to good arguments. The conclusions are clear with no ambiguity and is supported by reasons which are appropriately qualified. And the reasons within the arguments are clearly explained, relevant and supported by relevant evidence. And finally, the argument cites reliable authorities as evidence. Please note that it is important to define concepts which forms your argument so that the argument is clear. There is no need to define every concept, but there are concepts which could be misunderstood or are too technical. Please see the examples on the slide. It is also important to use reliable sources for definitions. It is essential to integrate evidence into academic arguments. The quality and credibility of evidence are very important. Now, sources of evidence need to be carefully considered. You also need to consider the credibility of the source. Example, a web source versus an academic journal. Which would you trust more? Other things to consider for academic arguments are given in this slide. Carefully consider the language. It is better to avoid strong claims. You could qualify your claim a bit more by stating what it is you are basing it on. For example, evidence suggests that this medicine is useful for this with this condition. It is also useful to integrate your critique of the source or method in the argument and always be open to and try to include counter evidence. Also, signal to the reader that you have used evidence extensively by using appropriate references. Now, we have discussed how to assess the strength and weakness of an argument. Now, have a look at this argument. It says, it's an obvious fact that women are discriminated against in many ways. As we know, they have more difficulty getting highly paid jobs, and fewer girls than boys are enrolled in schools. Now, what do you think about this argument? Could you critique this argument, look at the strengths and weaknesses, and how could you make it stronger? Are the reasons justified? Is there evidence backing the reasons? This is the end of this lecture, and this slide and the next slide have references and additional reading which you might find useful. Thank you for listening.